Fantastic. So yes, thank you everybody for joining. My name's Heather and I'm one of the researchers on this project with Jackie, as Claire mentioned. Before we get going, I just wanted to raise that there is a QR code on the screen here, and this takes you to a Padlet. There are a few discussion points that we'll have throughout this session. As you know, it's informal and the goal is to have some nice discussion back and forth, and it would be really great as we're talking about what we're doing in our institution to also hear about some of the other work that's going on across the sector. So please do click on that Padlet. I believe, as a technical note, my first technical note to remember, that if you are logged into Padlet, it won't be anonymous, but if you're logged out, then it will be anonymous posting. So if you want it to be anonymous, just make sure you're logged out. Just admitted somebody, hope that's okay. So moving on to then the project team. So there are 4 of us here today. So like I say, myself and Jackie, and also we're joined by Sally and Georgie, who are from the Access and Articulation team. So we're all within the University of Aberdeen. This project started in a sense based on discussions between Jackie and I within the School of Psychology. So I'm the coordinator of Level 2 theory, and Jackie also has quite a large role in terms of teaching our undergraduate programme. And so quite informally, we noticed that despite all the really great work that's going on, particularly within the institution at Aberdeen on pre-entry support for advanced entry students, and also the sector-wide support, which we'll talk a bit more about in due course. We noticed that there was some challenges, some specific experiences of what we're terming advanced entry students at the university. So by advanced entry students, we are meaning students who are transitioning to university from a further education institution such as college into level 2 or 3 from studies. So we're terming these advanced entry students. You might know them as other terms, so articulation students. Students themselves also often at our institution anyway identify themselves as direct entry students. So there's various terms that are often used, but really what we're meaning here is students that have entered into level 2 or 3 from college. So like I say, Jackie and I became interested in this from our personal experiences. And then we've made contact and we've worked quite closely with our Access and Articulation team. So Georgie and Sally, who are within that team in particular, have been really great for giving us the wider institutional and sector-wide context. And we've also been really we're very beneficial to have received funding from the Learning and Teaching Enhancement Programme based on the enhancement theme of resilient learning communities. And that's allowed us to hire 4 different student interns across 3 years of the project now to work on various aspects. So the goal really of today is to give an overview of the different phases of the project. Some of these phases we've talked about before, so if anybody's joined us for when we've talked about particularly our earlier work, we talked about a little bit at the QA conference last year, but I guess the function of today is to give a bit of an update about where that project's at now, and like I say, also to open up the discussion more widely to the rest of the group. So yes, I've given a bit of an overview about what we mean by advanced entry students, and a few of the other key questions that I guess underpin the broad work that we're doing in this project is these questions that are related to the resilient learning communities work. So how can we support students? This is really the question that we're all interested in, right? And particularly this group of students who we did think we're still facing some issues despite the various things that are in place. Of course, then a big question is, what do we mean by resilience? And so broadly, we're taking a definition of the capacity to be able to deal with bounce back in the face of challenge, transitions being one big challenge. So how do these students work around that transition to university, but also throughout university? And importantly, resilience not just being an individual capacity, but resilience being something about drawing on the resources, the social, the informational resources that are available, and being able to use those to the best of students' advantage. And of course, resilience is a key skill, and it's also described as a key transition skill by QA Scotland. So yes, so that's what we are, the goal is with this project. And just to give a bit of a background literature in terms of transitions and what, particularly at the start of this project, really prompted our approach to this this research and kind of pedagogical project is we kind of drew on a couple of different areas of research. So one is this balancing of preparedness and support before, during and after transition. So Anderson has done a lot of work looking at kind of what makes successful transitions, and this balancing, like I say, of individual preparedness transition, but also that support that's given in it being a kind of joint relationship between those two things. And also we looked at transitions at 3 different levels. So the individual level, so what individuals do to feel prepared, for instance, for a transition, things like confidence, self-esteem. Relational, so the changing relationships with both peers, so social relationships, as well as within the educational context. And finally, contextual changes as well. So the actual physical environment, also the technological environment is also important for that as well, and also the changing curricular expectations, for instance, between college and university, and also between the different stages of university. So that's a very brief overview of the kind of context to this project. So we'll take you through, we're kind of broadly calling this 3 phases of the project. Broadly, I say that's kind of 3 years of the project, 3 different funding applications that we've had for this project as well. The first phase of the project was very much about understanding the experiences of our advanced entry students, and we aim to do this through focus groups with advanced entry students. And this part of the project was particularly driven by one of our interns, Carrie. So Carrie's now way past her internship, and she's now graduated and she's in the world of work. So she's not able to be with us today, but she was really fundamental for this aspect of the project. And she herself was an advanced entry student, so she also had lived experience of this. And this was really important to us as well for when she was interacting with students and also interacting with the data. And we had some really useful and interesting conversations with her about that. So the aims of this project were to understand, so the question that we had are, what are advanced entry students' experiences of preparedness and support in relation to their transition to university, and across these 3 different contexts that I mentioned before. The goal of this project then was to produce some recommendations that could be implemented to support students at the University of Aberdeen, and also disseminate the key findings within our institution, but also, of course, across the sector more widely. So we ended up conducting 12 focus groups. The focus groups differed in size. There was also a few one-to-one interviews, just because recruitment was quite difficult. But in total, we had 12 focus groups and interviews that were all guided by semi-structured interview schedule. And that gave us a total of 25 participants. And these were students not just within psychology, but from across the institution. And they ranged from levels 2 to 4. So there were some students that had just transitioned to university from college. There were some that were nearing the end of their degree. And it was quite important to us to have that broad range of experience, and for students to be able to kind of bounce ideas off each other, because we were also able to get some of that hindsight from students that perhaps had progressed a bit later in their studies as well. We had quite good representation of our kind of feeder colleges as well. So there was a total of 9 further education colleges that were represented across our participants. And with the data, or Carrie particularly, used inductive thematic analysis to generate themes. So what I'll do is I'm going to quite briefly go over the data that I guess the analysis here, because we have presented this a little bit before, but I'm more than happy to discuss I guess the themes and recommendations a bit further with anybody. If they would find useful, please do get in contact. But generally, we could distinguish between quite descriptive themes and recommendations, which was primarily driven by Carrie, And this was very much about tangible, descriptive things that we could perhaps put in place, or just challenges that were raised. And we also had more latent themes as well, which I'll come on to in a moment's time. So in total, there were about 10 themes and recommendations that were created by Carrie. For a matter of space, I'll just overview a few of the key ones here. So one was that institutional support plays a key role in settling students. So the recommendations associated with this were having specific induction events for advanced entry students, the key role of personal tutors, and the knowledge of advanced entry status for these personal tutors. So particularly having a key person to go to was raised as really important for advanced entry students. Importantly, a lot of the time students were not just saying this is something that they wanted that was missing, but things that actually were in place already and that they really valued. So like I say, the team within the university, and particularly Sally's team centrally, already does a lot of work when it comes to induction and when it comes to kind of communicating to different schools. So a lot of the time that was described as really valuable, but sometimes there were some gaps in communication, which I'll come on to as well. Another key point that was raised was, I guess, more relating to the preparedness aspect, and perhaps the kind of more individualistic preparedness, but also linking with relational aspects, is having realistic expectations to facilitate preparation. So some students described that there was perhaps gaps in what colleges, the way that they described what university would be like versus what it was actually like when they arrived, and they felt kind of in hindsight they weren't quite prepared because their expectations didn't quite match with reality. So some recommendations that came out as a result of that was things like highlighting similarities and differences in course content between college and university, and also just having somewhere to ask all these questions that students sometimes just don't feel comfortable asking, these silly questions, for instance. Finally, social support was described as important in what we kind of said, reassuring advanced entry students. So peer support about what to expect and opportunities to meet other advanced entry students. And that lends quite nicely onto our kind of more latent themes as well. So I'll just move on to that slide now. So I have presented this a little bit before, so apologies if people have seen these 3 themes before, but just to kind of briefly overview or recap some of the things that we thought kind of underpin some of the things that students were talking about. So one was this, the idea of Goldilocks and the support that is just right. So students talked about a tension of kind of needing some sort of support, but also not wanting to feel babied and sometimes prior education feeling a little bit like being treated like children, and an overabundance of information. Whereas at university, it was sometimes described as a bit too much in the other direction, feeling some quite emotive descriptions, for instance, like feeling dragged through the trenches. This also, I guess these themes are all really quite interrelated. So sticking out but not feeling seen really comes to this idea of the social but also the institutional support. So for instance, in the social domain, feeling like they were kind of sticking out like a sore thumb in some of the cohorts. So who is this person? She's new, where's she been? Particularly moving into the later stages where the social groups have perhaps already been established. But at the same time, linking with that idea of support, feeling like that it is a slightly different experience, but you just look like any other student. So in a way, sometimes feeling slightly invisible as well. So again, there was a bit of a tension there in student responses. And finally, students talked quite a lot in terms of the tangible things that they would like support on, really about these kind of unknown unknowns, this kind of idea of the hidden curriculum. So students talked about this, for instance, in terms of the unofficial etiquette at university. So how do you contact people? How do you address people? Is it doctor and professor? Can you be more informal? And this really links with this idea of the preconceptions and the kind of expectations of what university might be like. And students talked about that, for instance, the things that you can't really find written down anywhere, and that being a particular avenue for increased support. So to overview just, I guess, a bit broadly about the place this took us. So there was of course key issues relating to student expectations, the identity of being a university student, and particularly I've kind of failed to mention as well that a lot of advanced entry students are students that are also from widening participation backgrounds. So perhaps mature students returning to learning, a lot of students often from lower SIMD groups. There was quite a lot of discussion, and we're still kind of working through this data to understand this in relation to things such as identity and the role of social capital. So informational capital, also kind of cultural capital, perhaps not having a support network outside of university in the same way that other students might have that kind of progress from level 1. And also in relation to this idea of the unknown unknowns, and we're kind of revisiting the literature on the ideas of the hidden curriculum. So all these implicit and embedded things that are within education that are not part of the written curriculum. And we think that that's quite important for us to draw more attention to, and perhaps be a bit more explicit to this group of students to raise these ideas and kind of normalize that we often have these questions, and it's really good to talk about these things. Okay, so a very brief overview of that phase, if you don't mind moving the slide on. So there's a couple of discussion points here for the group. What I think I'll do is I'll just pause for a moment to see if there's any immediate points in the chat, and we could perhaps come back to the Padlet at the end of the session. There'll be opportunity to chat about all the questions. But does anybody in the meantime have any questions about phase 1? So I see Mike adding to the hidden curriculum the notion of informal learning as well. So I think that's a really good point. Yeah. So the kind of learning that comes outside of the set curriculum. And again, I think that that's something that is valuable to consider for all students, because there's so many different avenues for learning, and it links quite closely to social support as well. So we have quite a lot of peer learning within our institution, and particularly within the School of Psychology. But again, that might be something that these students feel a little bit on the back foot of if they don't already have those established social groups. So maybe it'd be useful to chat about that a little bit further on as well. But just so I'll get all my chatting out of the way. First, I'll just briefly then move on to what we did with this, and that links quite closely onto phase 2 of the project. So again, there's a couple of questions there in the Padlet in relation to get your thoughts going and to open up the discussion at the end of the session. But phase 2 generally aimed to develop student-led content to provide peer support for advanced entry students. So I've talked a little bit specifically, or it's in the slides here, about peer content, but the goal is in this phase of the project to not just provide student-led content, but also to think about the way of communicating all of the support that already exists. So part of that will be student content, and some of that is generating new student-led content, but also we already within our institution, like I've said a few times, and Sally's group, the Access and Articulation team have already done a great amount of work, and there's pockets of support across the university. But what we thought when we were kind of making sense of the data is that there's perhaps a bit of an issue with communication. That's something that Sally will talk about, Jackie, sorry, will talk about in a moment's time. But in terms of both delivering informational support and also that important role of peer support, we saw the value of being able to develop support materials that are made for students by students. So this phase was really underpinned by the aim of kind of co-construction with students. And this phase was also led by a student intern. So particularly one of our interns, Rosalia, led on the development of the student-led content. And the goal here was to provide practical tips for university, but as well to uncover some of these ideas of the unknown unknowns. So we started this project by just aiming to create a variety of resources. So videos, podcasts, blogs were really quite unstructured. We didn't want it to be formal in any way, so we didn't want it to be us sitting recording more lectures, but instead to kind of be led by our student intern in terms of the sorts of resources that might be able to be generated alongside, I guess, in result from the recommendations from this project. So what we did, and this actually, it was really nice that we ended up developing a toolkit for students, so an online toolkit, and you can see an example of it. Or this is I guess the cover page of the toolkit. So University of Aberdeen has a toolkit resource, and we have a kind of toolkit team that creates toolkits on a variety of things. And it's an online place where we can gather a variety of different resources together in one place. And then this can be left open for students that they can access at any time. So we can also embed it into various different areas. So for instance, we could embed it into the advanced entry website support pages. We could embed it into course pages in a variety of places. The great thing about this toolkit is when we were considering how to communicate all these support resources to students, it was actually our intern, Rosalia, who again was an advanced entry student herself, who came up with the idea of generating this into a toolkit. And she thought that there was a few benefits of that in particular. So one was to do with the technological aspect. So kind of meeting students when where they're at, having maybe another induction session where we invite students along and give all this information at the start of term might not be the most beneficial way of doing it, but rather having something online that students can access at a time that suits them, or perhaps later and after their transition, where they're starting to notice that they are perhaps struggling with a few aspects, so they can go back to this resource at any point. So there was a few advantages of compiling these sorts of resources within a toolkit that she was very good at advocating for. So we went with this really great idea. So if you don't mind moving back to that slide, Jackie. So you'll see, I guess, just to give a bit of an overview about what's covered in the toolkit. First of all, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there is a carousel of videos. And so these were all videos that were again generated by Rosalia through speaking with other advanced entry students. So there's some students that are interviewed and on camera. There's also some quotes that are included with some music and visuals in the background. And they cover a variety of topics. So like I say, some of them are a bit more practical. So for instance, there is a video on what you should take to your first lecture, what's in your bag for a class. And there's also some more general videos about the kind of unknown unknowns. So one word to describe university, what are some of the benefits and challenges of that transition, just general advice from advanced entry students to other advanced entry students as well. So a variety of videos. You also see that there's other tabs for guides, information, and links as well. So if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, Jackie. Yes, so here's just an example of the sort of links that we have so far. So here's some examples of the links that we have within the institution. So we've got advanced entry support, so things such as funding, accommodation, the kind of more technological aspects, but also the more pastoral and social and peer support as well. So links to the variety of services and support that we already provide, but just in a place that are easily accessible for students as well. We also intend to include some of the great work that's been already conducted by the QAA. So there's already a lot of transition support materials that have been created, and that's also, we hope to be able to link to that as part of the toolkit as well. And finally, we also have some blogs that have been written. So I appreciate it's not perhaps the clearest here, but we had some blogs written by students about their experiences of advanced entry. And we really wanted students to be quite candid about this. So not just, I mean, I think sometimes blogs can be a little bit about the kind of sunny side of everything and about what a great experience things were. But we didn't want to hide from students the fact that it can be a bit of a challenge to transition to university. But importantly, it was that there's a solution and there's places to go and there's ways to overcome these challenges. So we have created interactive blogs as part of the toolkit as well. So as you can see here on the screen, it's perhaps not so clear, but there are links embedded throughout this. So as a student's talking about perhaps some of the challenges that they faced, I think this student was saying that they had a few mental health difficulties that they were experiencing throughout their studies after they transitioned to university. And what we've done is we've linked to, so if students feel like they can relate to that at all, this is where you go for support. Or if they feel like they perhaps took a while to understand where they could go to look at opportunities for peer support, then this is a place that they can go to, they can try, or this is where they can go to ask questions about this topic and so on. So the notes that are at the bottom there are kind of a flip deck of notes that students can go through and click to places where they can access all the existing support that we have already. Okay, so I'll now hand over to Jackie, who I think is now going to take over in terms of just a bit of overview and discussion. I see there's also been some chat messages, which is fantastic as well.
Yeah, I've been shown up as not being able to multitask, so trying to type a response and also move slides was clearly too much for my simple mind. So I apologise for that. There's some really nice comments coming up in the chat as well. We just wanted to pose a couple of questions to yourselves as well. Sorry, I'm looking between two screens now, so I'm going to look like I'm not paying attention. What methods of communication do you use? Communication has been really fundamental, and I think we probably across all our institutions feel like we do a good job in communicating to students, and we give them a lot of information, but that in itself can be problematic. And that was one of the things, one of the sort of general themes that came up about students feeling overwhelmed at getting too much information maybe all at the one time. So interested to see what methods of communication you use, and you know, how do you consider timing? Do you consider timing, and what do you do about it? And are there any particular methods you find useful? Again, we are finding, don't know how other people feel. I have a level 1 theory course in psychology, and sometimes I communicate quite a lot, but students maybe just aren't using that method of communication. So if there are any fantastic ideas out there, we would love to hear. So again, if you just use the Padlet, but also in the chat as well. I am going to move on, but there's just a couple of things. So Luke was asking in the chat just about examples of how students integrate with those that are already, you know, those that have completed the first year. And that's where the student resources come in a little bit. Look, it's not a case of saying to students, it's your responsibility, but we have asked students who've been in that situation, what kind of, I don't know, strategies have they used? You know, there's a couple of nice examples in there about someone talking about, you know, just, it sounds simple, but going up and asking someone what the time is outside a lecture when you're all waiting and a group of people are chatting and you don't know anyone. I mean, you know, it sounds really simplistic, but even just little bits of tips and advice as to how students might be able to support themselves as well as us supporting them. Look, yeah, I see you've.
Yeah, it's just I suppose a question about, you know, do you design in space into the curriculum to make this happen, or you know, is this, you know, your first piece of group work that the students do? This is when you hope these principles are woven in, type of thing.
I think that's a really good point. And what we've done in psychology as a result of this work is created a different sort of induction chat, really. But saying that, that's specifically for advanced entry students to get together themselves, but then the purpose is to integrate them. So for instance, it's not related to advanced entry students, but I have moved, for instance, a group project in level 1 right to the very beginning of term, so the students get to know each other. So it's looking at the, you know, even if it's assessments and assignments, actually, how can we build that in to make it a much smoother, natural kind of, you know, just organic process. So I think these are the things now we need to go back and start to think about, right, how do we actually embed some of this in the curriculum as well as having the support tool? I think it's a really good point, and definitely things that we're starting to think about now. There's another question there. Heather, you can maybe look at that for from Megan, because it's really important about assessment, and absolutely, Megan, it has come up about assessment. You're bang on. So yeah, we can maybe come back to that later on. So just going on to the last phase of sort of where we are now, this is where we've maybe done not less work, but we're very much in the process of this work. We're looking at the sort of, we're interested now from the staff perspective about what we can do to support staff, to help support students, what support's out there that's accessed, what support's out there that's not accessed, but also what's just not there at the moment. So we look to do, as I say, looking to understand and enhance the support that's available to staff. What we find is our access and articulation team, I expect many of you are the same, are excellent and do such a wonderful job. But a lot of that's pre-entry. And so what we find is maybe post-entry things change a little bit. They're less, it's less consistent. So we're interested in finding across our institution the sort of pockets of support that are available and the examples of good practice. And then ultimately to develop a sort of, I suppose in the same vein, a suite of resources for staff to help that continued support for advanced entry students as they continue through university, not just as they transition into. I think that's really quite important. So what we've done is we've carried out a staff survey, as well as some staff interviews. The survey we've done, and we're going to hold our hands up here a little bit and say that maybe some, not issues with the staff survey. I think we probably need to run another one to make it more nuanced. We've got some really nice information from it, but I think now we need to start thinking about actually who in the institution has the most contact with advanced entry students, because a lot of our staff may not come across them in as regularly or have as much kind of personal contact with them as others, and maybe we have to start small, right? Maybe we have to start with those that have a lot of contact with advanced entry students. So we might make that staff survey a little bit more targeted. But the staff interviews are currently going on, so we don't really have any data from them yet, just to try and drill down a little bit into some of the data. But what's been really nice is, nice, I don't know if that's the right word, but we found a couple of things that align. So for example, the staff's perception of challenges, and let me say here, it's not just challenges faced by advanced entry students, they have so many more strengths to bring to the table as well. But staff's perception of challenges sort of align with those that the students have reported, certainly in our data collection that we've had so far. So for instance, that sense of belonging, the kind of misplaced assumptions, that they know what the learning environment is going to be like, but it's maybe a bit different. That sort of shift in expectations from staff. So coming back to what Megan was saying earlier about sort of assessment expectations when you come into second or third year. So we find that the perceptions align. So, I mean, I think that's a good starting point. We're all sort of on the same page about that. There's a range, staff reported a range of activities offered to support advanced entry students, but again, it seems to sort of stop and end with, for instance, our access and articulation team. There's not necessarily a lot of stuff that we're aware of or that is embedded right across the institution in terms of sort of post-entry. Mixed responses we found from staff about knowing who to contact within their school or their college, or certainly the terms we use in Aberdeen, about who to contact about advanced entry students if they have a particular issue. And then there's this bigger question, I think, a little bit about whether your personal tutors are informed. I say personal tutors, I don't know if everyone has the same kind of system, but that sort of named contact for a student once they're in university. So should the personal tutors be informed of the advanced entry student status? I'll come back to that question in a minute, actually. So what we're looking to do, what we're at this point is considering the barriers for staff. Okay, we have to understand workload. Workload is an issue, whether that's right to say or not. So what can we do for staff that can make it easier for them to support advanced entry students? Now, a lot of staff may say, well, I would give them the same support as I would give any other student, but we know there are nuances. We know there are different situations sometimes that come up that are maybe more targeted towards advanced entry students and maybe more specific than others. So what, I suppose, quick wins, what are the things we can put in place to make it easy for staff to provide, but very valuable and useful for those students coming in that are facing particular challenges? And how do we communicate? How do we communicate with students? How do we, at what points through the year or through their degree do we start to communicate particular ideas or particular bits of information we think are really important? So what we would like to do is to have a staff workshop. That's our plan. I say what we'd like to do. Our plan is to have a staff workshop later on in term, when we will get the biggest buy-in from staff. It's still considering, whether that's open to everyone or whether we try and start with particular targeted members of staff initially, and try and think about putting together the resources that we have, the good practice that we've seen across the institution and perhaps from yourselves, and then just try and figure out the best way forward, really, for all of us. What we also want to do from that is to create a community of practice. I know community of practice is a very, it's very popular at the moment, but we need a community of practice, that works, that is not just there in name, but it's going to add value to what we're doing. So we're really keen to get that community of practice going. We've got a sort of small, a fairly small one as it is, but if we can keep that community of practice going and grow that, share the practices, the good practices across our institutions and ideas, in order to just support these students. And the work that we do with advanced entry students is probably going to benefit everyone, if we're honest, but ultimately our interest at the moment is helping these students help these students achieve their best outcomes. There shouldn't be a difference in outcomes at the end of a degree, regardless of your background, but we know that's not the case. So what can we do at the moment to try and, to advance that, I suppose. So a couple of discussion points again. So if anyone's in the Padlet, if you have any examples of good practice for supporting advanced entry students, how you evaluate the practice, because I think that's a really important element, right? We can be very good at coming up with these ideas and throwing them out there. But how do we evaluate them? What's the best way to do so? What's the most valuable way? So really interested in hearing how people evaluate the processes that they have in place, because I think that's going to be a really beneficial element to it. And then what barriers have you encountered relating to supporting students? So we're going to leave the Padlet open for about another week anyway, so there's no rush to it, but it'd just be really nice to get other people's sort of thoughts and experiences on that as well. So I think they're just a sort of list of the questions, but I think, as Heather has mentioned in the chat, we have our student intern who actually starts next week. Kia's going to be working on the sort of evaluating the toolkit, which I think is going to be a really important element. The toolkit is designed to be flexible, sustainable, and sort of future-proof, right? So it's going to evolve as people feed into it, as we get evaluation back, as we learn what's not there, what could be there, and that is it's a really flexible design, the toolkit, so we can add to it as we go. But Kia is going to be working on that in the next few weeks. So I think that's us. Heather, have I forgotten anything? Or
no, I don't think you have. Just, I guess, to extra plug that community of practice a little bit. So it was actually after the QA conference last year, we set up a Teams group, basically, because we see, and I can see it already from this chat, that there are so many pockets across the sector, across Scotland, of examples of good practice of this. So it would be, if anybody, to continue to share this practice beyond today, would like to be involved with that Teams group. We often just post links to things, but we also sometimes have the odd Teams chat for anybody, kind of meetings for anybody that like to see examples in a bit more detail. If anybody would like to join that, then just either just pop a message here with your email, or drop me an email and you can be added to that Teams group. It's pretty informal, and I see that there's a few from that group already that are in the session, which is fantastic. I did see that there was, I guess, one of the discussion points is so I see, Mike, you've mentioned about Beth Hannah, and yes, so yeah, from Dundee, yes. aware of that work on the transitions and across educational sphere. So certainly we're tapping into some of that insight, but perhaps even just contacting and saying about that as well would be great. But there's also, I guess one of the discussion points was about examples of good practice. And I did note that there were a couple of things that I was like, oh, I'd like to hear more about that. So I think, Mike, you mentioned about an online course. So I don't know if you're happy to share a little bit more about that. Again, either here or maybe in the Teams group. And also Luke, with this 10 credit module, it'll be really great to hear more about that as well. Yeah, Luke, very happy to add you to that Teams group.
So just very briefly, in terms of one of the areas I'm involved in teaching, to enable our students in colleges in the university program, we set up one of the tutors for our advisors that we use, and their role is to help them get access to the university systems. It's very easy to sort of do online module that's there as a sort of part of the catalogue of modules that's really just about transitioning to university, and that they do in the first semester. So effectively it's their HNC year, and then in the second semester they're invited to join another module which takes place in a community setting. So it's a kind of halfway between college and university. So that's been very successful on those small numbers, and therefore I'm not sure how it was expanded, although that's a model that we're trying to replicate in other areas.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And sorry, I don't know if it's my audio, but I couldn't quite catch every part that you said there. But it sounds really useful to have that pre-entry, more kind of support there. I wonder, is it, I'm sorry if you've mentioned this, but is it for one specific feeder college that you have a relationship with already, or is it open to all?
Well, it is open to all, but we have to have an agreement, if you like, in order to ensure that there's a match between the subject areas. But I have been involved in this from the other side, from the college side of view, when I worked with Aberdeen University from Dundee and Angus College, and we stepped up it was called the Institute of Sport. And so I was the kind of the college's side of that. And that was very successful. That was a short-term funded project. And that is one of the challenges that, the short-term projects are great unless there's some kind of onward sort of planning. But you're also trying to build momentum to change the culture of the hurdle from college to university. Well, that's my experience anyway.
That's great. I think, yeah, that idea about the changing of the culture is one of the things I think that if we could keep chipping away at it, I think, because there's no point pretending that there's not been so much work that's been gone across the years in these different pockets. But if we could all kind of take a little bit from what the different examples that have been going on, I guess we've adopted more of an approach that is perhaps smaller in scale, right? Because it's a toolkit, and it's actually, once you've got the resources, it's quite easy to create. But the goal with that being that it's quite low in terms of resources to keep up and maintain, and it can be constantly updated as well. But certainly it would be great to mine everybody else's experiences, and we're happy to also share any resources from the toolkit as well. There's no point reinventing the wheel. So yeah, that's great. I've not been keeping chat on top of the chat. Jackie, is there anything else?
There's quite a few things there, actually. I think we're probably going to run out of time, but just in terms, there's a couple of things just to point out. Anne was asking earlier about how does the research fit with what goes before. This is nothing new. I'm not saying that we found really different findings. What we find still sits exactly what's found in the literature before. I suppose for us, what the concern was, it's not necessarily moving on, certainly for the students that we came across, and that was why we wanted to sort of look at what are the easy ways that we can maybe just make the information available to students, because I certainly don't think it's not necessarily that it's there. There is some new stuff that we're developing. Obviously, the peer support by the students is really important, but it's about having that information in an available place that students can dip in and out of when they feel the need, rather than us directing them to it. And again, Megan, just back to that question about assessment, I think that's really important, and we're trying to put in places links to student learning service where they can, they can access support, also peer assisted learning that we run. Certainly in psychology, we run that where students a year above can mentor those in the year below, and maybe give some work on that, but making all that available in this one fairly kind of tidy resource that, it looks like a lot of information, but our worry is always more and more and more, give students more to go and look at, more to go and find, more to go and do themselves. That's not the idea. The toolkit's there to try and bring it all together, but recognise that there are other things that are not in existence at the moment, and that, the guidance from students who have been there, who have done it, who have that hindsight and can, tell us the things they wish they had, but also the strategies they employed, I think is really valuable there as well. There's loads of things coming up in the chat that are really interesting. Claire, you said this is recorded. We'll get access to the comments, will we? That we can maybe take forward later on, would that be?
Yeah, Jackie, I'll record the chat so you can follow up with colleagues who've asked questions or who've posted further resources for you to have a look at. Yeah. That
would be really good, because I feel that we're probably going to miss quite a bit here actually as well. But I am also aware of time. So if there's anything I miss, if anybody wants to just use their mic, stick up a hand if there's anything. We will go through the chat and the comments and hopefully get back to people as well, if that's okay. My multitasking isn't fabulous.
Can I just come in to follow up on I asked a question in the chat about the evaluation of the toolkit, and it was just to throw it out there that I'm from UHI and we have similar support resources for students, and we have a handle on the number of users, but not necessarily the impact of that and whether that was what the users were looking for. So I asked a question about evaluation, and it would be just really interesting to find out whether, whether the resources are enough or how they get the resources. We email our students all the time, and is it, word of mouth from another student that might lead students more effectively to the things that they need to know about? So yeah, it's a hard nut to crack, and I think we've probably all been circling around it for many years.
Absolutely, and I think that's a brilliant point, Heather, and it's something we're really keen to try and do, and to do well, which is what we always have the best intentions, right? But I think the evaluation part of it's going to be really important. What's the point of having just something else there if it's not used or just not useful, But it'd be really interesting to get in touch when we have, more discussion about that as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, I guess to give a bit of more detail on the way that we intend to evaluate. So we're still very much at the beginning stages of this, so also very happy to get advice or ideas. The primary goal for CARE is to create, so the toolkit is going to be launched to all students in the next couple of weeks. And the goal is that as that's launched and as it's communicated directly to students, so they'll probably get an email saying this is the toolkit, and we'll also have a survey there that they can then give their initial thoughts on. But also a bit later down the line, we're hoping to be able to pair up with we have a wellbeing team within the university that holds a lot of events for the whole student group, but also for specific groups such as articulation students, advanced entry students. So perhaps to have some sort of informal get together for the advanced entry students, that they can come together, chat a bit about the toolkit, maybe say things that are missing, things that would be useful, because we know that for evaluation it's important not just to get it in the moment, because it's sometimes, and the student data kind of suggested this, that it's not until later that students realise that they were missing something, or they realised that there was some support there that might have been lacking. So we do see this as kind of the first stage in a kind of longer term evaluation as well.
I think that's us, right. I'm going to go through the chat and just get back to people after this, because I clearly can't multitask as well as I thought. I'm trying to reply to Megan while we chat. But it's been really useful. The comments are brilliant, really, really helpful as well for us, because we're holding our hands up and saying, you know we haven't got everything right yet, so how do we make it better? So just working with others, hearing what others do, what others have done, and it's maybe has worked, but maybe hasn't worked, I think is as valuable as anything else. So thank you for all the comments.
That's been really interesting. I'm just new in the experience engagement and wellbeing team, and yeah, obviously in Aberdeen University. So yeah, if you guys, Heather, if you want to come and give us a shout, and we can help promote some of this stuff for you. But yeah, link is in. Give us a shout.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you very much to Jackie and Heather for presenting today. There is a collaborative cluster that's just started this academic year called Mind the Gap, and it's researching a very similar area to yourselves. It's being led by colleagues at City of Glasgow College. So this is the first college university collaborative cluster we've got. It also involves colleagues from Edinburgh and Napier and Glasgow Caledonian University. So I can pass on contact details there, Heather and Jackie. But thank you so much to you both and to everyone who's come along and participated. And I'm absolutely delighted to see we've had some students along today. So thank you all very much for giving up your time. We will have another one of these coming up in the next wee while, and we'll promote that to you folks as soon as we can. But thank you so much, and until the next time, everyone stay safe. Bye, folks.
Bye.
Everyone.